Rachel, welcome back to the show. Always a pleasure to see you. Can you tell us anything about what happened in that synagogue?
You know, George, this seems to be one of those stories where still there are far more questions than answers. Now, you mentioned so far that the suspect is a British national. We just learned that news today, actually. Yesterday, whenever we were looking at this story, they didn't say who it was, didn't say what his motive was. And as of this point, we still don't have a motive. Now, one of the most interesting things about this, as you mentioned, was that a large part of this standoff, of this siege, was actually live streamed because a number of churches and synagogues now have turned to live streaming on Facebook, on YouTube, as a way to be able to connect with their congregations. Well, in this case, they didn't actually see the siege play out on that Facebook live stream, but they did hear a lot of what happened. And what was strange about it was that even though there were 4 people that were taken hostage, they continually heard the suspect say things as though he was not going to harm them. And it doesn't appear that he did harm them in any way. Now, a big question, of course, for the FBI was what kind of weapons he had, what he was armed with. And they thought at one point that he may be armed with some sort of bomb materials. We're still waiting for a follow-up on that. They're claiming that they found some sort of firearm near him that they believed was his. We're, of course, still waiting for confirmation on that. But it is notable that the FBI went in after over 10 hours and shot the suspect dead. And of course, this is one of those cases where we're still waiting to see. I know the Biden administration has commented on it and they say they're confused. And on that, I agree with them. There is a lot of confusion here about why this man specifically targeted the synagogue. I know the FBI has said that they believe that it was in relation to a Pakistani neuroscientist who is being held in prison for life nearby in Fort Worth.
Afia Siddiqui, yeah.
Yeah, why he would target the synagogue, I sincerely don't know.
What sort of place is Colleyville, Texas?
So that is a suburb of Dallas. So a pretty, traditional Texas suburb, nothing really special going on there, which I think is why you get kind of that bigger question of why he would have targeted that in the first place. Maybe we'll find out about that. I mean, maybe we'll find out some more details, but it is kind of a lot of questions about why he would come there specifically to that suburb of Dallas and to that synagogue.
Now, I'm told that flights to China have been suspended for the Winter Olympics. Oh, for COVID reasons, of course. If you believe that, I've got a bridge here in London to sell you. How is that going down?
Yeah, it seems to be just this kind of ramping up of the continued political tensions between the U.S. and China. And it raises a lot of questions, of course, about why the Biden administration has decided that they are going to take the Olympics, something that we all enjoy watching, and turn it into much more of a political situation. And of course, they are going to say that it's COVID related. And, it's one of those things where you would think that the U.S. government would be focusing more on what's going on in our own country. But instead, now they have taken that shift. And, I think it's one of those things where it really is unfortunate because the repercussions of that then come back to impact all of the athletes that worked for it to be able to get there. And I know you've been covering the Novak Djokovic story, but it's just yet another thing that comes back around to not leaving the sport alone and instead getting politics and policies involved with it.
It's a bit like a tennis match. I mean, one day it's China under the hammer. The next day it's Russia. I was surprised at this banning of the flights to China because I thought that your government was currently fixated by Russia, claiming that Russia is about to invade Ukraine. Senator Cruz said in the Senate this week that Ukraine was about to be wiped off the map, a flight of fancy that almost defies description. The ramping up of anti-Russian feeling, and it's got to be said, the answers from Moscow are becoming extremely alarming. Mr. Lavrov, the normally very mild-mannered foreign minister of Russia, said this week that Russia was ready to go, that we'd run out of patience, we're ready to go. He didn't say go where, but he clearly meant something big.
Yeah, he clearly did. And first and foremost, when it comes to Ted Cruz and anything he says, unfortunately, he's also from Texas. I do not take credit for any of that. However, he was one of those who decided that he was going to push for more sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, we have to remember that the Trump administration spent its entirety trying to defeat this pipeline. It failed miserably. Then the Biden administration came in and decided that it was going to defeat the pipeline. It has also failed so far, even when it sat there and it threatened direct sanctions against Germany, one of its closest allies. It still didn't get anywhere with that. The pipeline is still built. Now it's just getting to that point of being certified. And you mentioned this ramping up of this continued Russiagate narrative in one way or another. And what's interesting is that new report that came out that was cited by CNN, of course, they turned to their trustworthy anonymous U.S. intelligence sources. And every single time we get a report citing those anonymous U.S. intelligence sources, I always take a step back and take another look at it, because it always has some sort of motive attached to it. In this case, its motive seems to be that they say that Russia is planning a false flag operation in eastern Ukraine in order to justify invasion. Now, my question is, well, why? What would be the motive behind that? How would Russia benefit from that, given the fact that they have the U.S. and some of its closest allies ready to jump at any kind of attack that would play out like that, ready to go to war, even though we can sit here and talk about how ridiculous and how dangerous that would be for the world all around. But it does not make sense to me when Russia has repeatedly said that where they stand in terms of protecting their country, why they would be out there not only planning a false flag attack, but why the U.S. officials would already be there, be ready for it. And it is one of those things where you have to look at the fact of who benefits from this, what the motive would be surrounding it. And it's the U.S. and its NATO allies who have been the ones ramping up tensions in that region. And of course, when it comes to that specific CNN report, it was no shock that it was written by the same quote unquote reporter who was the one pushing the Russiagate narrative and the Steele dossier, and has literally been making her career out of pushing those false narratives for going on nearly 6 years now.
The good news is, if it was on CNN, nobody would have seen it, because CNN has lost 90%, 90% of its audience in the last year. I can't say that makes me sad at all. I'll tell you what I think is going to happen, Rachel. I think all of this talk is to provide a cover for the precise opposite of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's going to be a Ukrainian invasion of those parts of eastern Ukraine that, since the coup in Kiev in 2014, have lain out with the authority of the central government. I believe they are the ones who are going to invade a territory which the Minsk agreement recognizes now needs to be treated as autonomous parts of Ukraine. And all this talk of false flags and the rest is a cover for that.
Absolutely. I would say you're spot on right there. And I think it's one of those cases where all roads lead back to Joe Biden. He was an important member of the Obama administration back in 2014. Now he's back in office today. And it is notable how all of a sudden the U.S. has started ramping up its sights specifically on Ukraine, and specifically trying to increase those tensions with Russia along the way. And that's exactly the way that they do it. They lead out with some sort of propaganda campaign. They make sure that those mainstream outlets like CNN, like Fox News, that they are all on board with it, and then they take action. And then you have CNN sitting right there saying, see, we told you that it was a false flag. We told you that our anonymous sources were correct. And they never take the time to issue any actual corrections or to look at the actual facts of the story, because they want to keep those so-called anonymous sources from the U.S. intelligence community.
I wonder if Joe Biden even knows it's all going on his watch. Lastly, and I'm grateful for your time as always, Rachel, is the Djokovic story playing in the United States at all? If so, how is it playing?
It is playing out right now, and I think it's really stirring up a lot of that frustration that we've seen, not only on the US stage, but also on the world stage. You know, it's interesting because when you get on Twitter on any given day, you can see these horrible police brutality videos of people being targeted for breaking lockdowns in Australia. I mean, we've seen videos of different prison camps, detainment camps in Australia. And so I think it brings us back around to kind of where we are with the COVID-19 vaccine right now. Now, I don't quite understand why Australia let him into the country and then made such a big deal about it afterwards. It feels as though they are making him into sort of the spectacle of the unvaccinated. But I think it's also important to remember that, as the CDC has said here in the US, these vaccines don't stop transmission. So to act as though he is some kind of dangerous figure, as they are trying to make him out to, and as a number of people support that theory, I think here in the US we're looking at it and realizing that this is the danger of that authoritarian, tyrannical power that a lot of governments want to have, and that the US government specifically wants to have when it comes to dealing with this situation. And now we are seeing the product of that with this athlete.
Rachel Blevins, thank you for joining us on the Mother of All talk shows.